I'm going to answer this question from Izzy, and she asked a great question about duality. So everything has an opposite, but she asked, what about God, our creator? So it depends, because at the source, the very quote unquote beginning, if that's what we want to say, there was no duality. We were just as we are. We were aware, conscious, but there was no creation and there was no self. So we decided, like, hey, I'd like to know what this awareness is. I'd like to know who I am. And so that began the process. That began the process of self-discovery. And we found that the best way to discover and to see was to perceive, to separate myself into other vantage points, to see from other lenses. How can I see myself if I don't have a mirror? And if I don't have eyes to view that? And if I don't have an experience to stimulate some form of movement, then what is that? How does that show up? So this process just continued to unfold. And we decided to create a reality where there was a perceived duality. And these acted as the bounds of creation, not that it's limited, but just creating seemingly opposite forces to play against each other. So everything in creation is dualistic. There is the masculine and the feminine side. There is the light and the dark side. There is the hot and the cold. Everything has that duality, and the interplay between these two is what creates the friction. Looking at chemistry, you have an acid and a base. That's the duality. You put baking soda, sodium bicarbonate with vinegar, an acid, so a base and an acid together, and what happens? A chemical reaction, a lot of friction, movement, action, life. So this stimulation is what creates this change. It's what creates this perfect experience to explore, to see what these differences yield, to see how they play against each other, recognizing that it's all self. And yeah, that's what happened. So this is just the culmination of that. So if you're examining God, the creator, to go back to the question, what about God, our creator? Is that dualistic? No. And yes, because there's creation and then there's the creator. So there's somewhat of a duality in that. And yet that converges back into one at some point of conceptualization. There is the initial, the one becomes the two, and then the journey is for the two to become one again. So if you can imagine that image, you've got one point, and you have that point splitting into two, one point becoming two. From that one point to the 2 points, you draw a line. You've got a triangle with no bottom, and then those two becoming one again. Below that, what shape does that create? It creates a diamond. So the one become two, the two become one. And this process happens over and over and over again. This is the configuration that creation is based on. And it creates an endless opportunity of change and growth and expansion and all the good stuff. So that's the reason why there's the duality. And you could view it from the two becoming one. So 2 + 1 is 3. So it's really the Trinity experience, splitting and reforming. So is God dualistic? Depends on how you look. Depends on what you're viewing. But ultimately, no. Ultimately, God exists outside of the duality, and we can exist outside of the duality. And the point is to remember that we do exist outside of the duality. The duality is simply the experience to have, but we are not the duality. We are one.